The boots were 2 sizes too large. She had stuffed the toes with paper from the household accounts ledger, a corner torn quietly, the numbers still faintly legible against the gray morning light, and laced them tight at the ankle, and stood in the lower corridor of Ashbourne Park at 4:30 in the morning, and told herself the sound they made against the stone was no different from the sound any servant made in the hour before the house woke. She had practiced being forgettable for 18 months. She knew how to arrange herself so that no one looked, so that the eye moved past, so that a woman could stand in the middle of a well-lit room and leave no impression, the way a stone dropped in still water leaves no record of itself once the surface closes. Her traveling bundle was small. She had not brought much when she came to Ashbourne, and she had accumulated less. A change of clothes, her father's prayer book, £3 and 7 shillings in coin, saved from her quarterly stipend by refusing the small luxuries Lady Edith occasionally offered as tests of gratitude. A single letter, folded 4 times, from a schoolfellow in Bath, who had written 3 years ago to say there might be a position as a teacher of French if circumstances ever required it. Circumstances had required it for some time. Cecily had simply not yet found the morning that felt final. This was the morning. The servants' gate was at the end of the lower corridor, past the kitchen passage, past the still room, past the door to the coal cellar that always stood slightly open. She had walked this corridor twice at this hour in the past week, rehearsing. She knew the 4th flagstone from the door to the hall sounded hollow under a heel. She knew the kitchen maid Agnes would already be at the range. She had borrowed Agnes's boots not from some calculated scheme, but because her own shoes, thin-soled city shoes, long since worn at the heel, would have been recognized at the tradesman's entrance if anyone happened to look down. Agnes's boots were the boots of someone who belonged to the back of the house, who could be going anywhere or nowhere in particular, who would not be remarked upon. She was 6 paces from the kitchen passage when the candle appeared. It was not the light that stopped her first. It was the stillness attached to the light. The candle was held in a man's hand, and the man holding it stood in the doorway to the lower study, with the unhurried quality of someone who had not been moving and had no particular intention of moving. He was tall in the low doorway, in shirt sleeves and no cravat, his dark coat thrown on without ceremony as though he had heard something and come down without thinking. His gray eyes in the candlelight were unreadable. They went to her face first, then to the bundle in her hand, then to her feet. He looked at her feet for a moment longer than courtesy required. Robert Weston, the Earl of Ashbourne, said nothing. Cecily Vane had spent 18 months practicing invisibility, and it had never once failed her. She stood in the lower corridor in another woman's boots with her whole life knotted in a cloth at her hip, and she found, to her considerable humiliation, that her face was warm. "Miss Vane," he said at last. His voice was low. The house slept above them. There was no one else in the corridor, which meant no witness to whatever this was, which meant it had not happened, and would not need to be explained, which was the only thought she managed before he said, "You are leaving." It was not a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes, my lord." He looked at her for another moment. Then he moved aside from the doorway. She thought, for one absurd and airless second, that he was going to let her go, that this was the kindness a man of his position extended to a woman of her situation at 4:30 in the morning, the decency of not forcing her to explain, the mercy of simply stepping back. He did not speak again. She walked past him. She did not look back. She should have kept walking. She did not yet know that he stayed in the doorway and watched the corridor until she rounded the corner, and that he set the candle down on the ledge where it guttered in the draught from the kitchen passage, and that he stood there in the dark for a time longer than a man dismissing a minor inconvenience would have needed to stand. What she did not yet know was that he had been watching her for considerably longer than the past 6 paces of this particular morning. Cecily Vane had arrived at Ashbourne Park in the first week of October, 18 months prior, in a hired post-chaise that deposited her at the tradesman's entrance, because she had not known to specify the front door. The confusion had been noted by the head footman, Rogers, who had delivered her to Lady Edith's sitting room with the manner of a man transporting something that did not quite belong in the category to which it had been assigned. Lady Edith had looked her over in the way of a woman accustomed to examining things for their practical utility, and had said, "You'll do," without specifying for what, and that had been the beginning. She was not, strictly speaking, a governess. There was no child to govern. There was Edmund, who was 3 years old at that point and entirely in the care of his nurse, and whom Cecily had not been expected to engage with in any formal capacity. She was Lady Edith's companion, which in practice meant this: she sat in the morning room and read aloud when Lady Edith was indisposed. She accompanied Lady Edith in the carriage on calls, when a second figure was required to suggest a social confidence Lady Edith would not otherwise have projected. She managed the correspondence with tradesmen when Lady Edith considered the subject beneath her attention. She attended dinners as a place filler, a female body between 2 male guests who had no one else to seat next to them. And she remained in whatever room she was placed in until she was needed, which meant that she spent a great deal of time in a condition of furnished absence. She had been a clergyman's daughter of Somerset. Her father had been a man of modest learning and large heart, who had died owing £17 and 4 shillings to a bookseller in Taunton, which was the most unsentimental summation of his life and career she had ever been able to manage. Her mother had died when Cecily was 11. There had been a brother, Thomas, who had gone to sea 3 years before their father's death, and whose letters had become increasingly infrequent and were now entirely absent. She had a school education, a good French accent, some skill at watercolor, and £3 and 7 shillings in a small purse sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak. She had no prospects that did not require the willingness of someone else to supply them. Lady Edith was not cruel in the deliberate way of women who enjoy cruelty. She was cruel in the manner of a woman who had long ago ceased to look carefully at the objects in her own house. Cecily was an object. Objects were not looked at. They were used. Lady Edith used her thoroughly and without malice and without noticing, which had the curious effect of being more erasing than any deliberate unkindness might have been. Cecily had discovered, over the course of her first winter at Ashbourne, that she had begun to agree with the arrangement, not in a conscious act of submission, but in the gradual way that water agrees with the shape of whatever contains it. She woke early and dressed plainly, and appeared where she was needed, and said what was expected, and moved through the great house without leaving a mark. The footman stepped around her. The housemaids barely noted her. The Earl acknowledged her presence at table with the same minimal courtesy he extended to the salt cellar. She thought about this. Sometimes, in the hour before the house woke, when she allowed herself the luxury of thinking. She had come to Ashbourne with a face and a name and a set of opinions about things, and 18 months of being consistently overlooked had performed some subtle surgery on her sense of all 3. She was not unhappy. That was the strangest part. She was simply less than she had been, in a way that had grown so gradual. She had nearly missed it entirely. It was Agnes, the kitchen maid, who had first made her see it clearly. Agnes was 18 and from the village, and entirely unimpressed by the social architecture of the great house, which gave her a clarity that Cecily had come to value above most things. Agnes had said, on a Tuesday morning in November, when Cecily had come down early to the kitchen for a cup of tea, and they had sat together for 20 minutes in the comfortable silence of two women who were not required to perform their roles for each other. "You know they talk about you as if you're a piece of furniture, don't you?" Cecily had said she was not certain she minded. Agnes had looked at her steadily and said, "That's what I mean." The season visit had begun in late April, when Lady Edith's plans for the year resolved themselves into the project she had been quietly managing for 6 weeks before she announced it. Mr. Forsyte and his daughter Helena were to come to Ashbourne for the summer, and by the end of the summer, Lord Ashbourne and Miss Helena Forsyte were to be engaged, and Lady Edith's household was to be secured against the particular anxieties of a dowager who has lived long enough to see her position rendered uncertain by death and inheritance, and the indifference of adult sons. Helena Forsyte was 22, and widely acknowledged to be everything the current season required. She was tall and fair, and moved through a room with the easy assurance of a woman who has been told from infancy that she was the correct answer to any question the room might be asking. She was not unkind. She was simply so thoroughly certain of her own position that she had never found it necessary to look carefully at anyone whose position was less certain. She and Cecily had exchanged perhaps 30 sentences in the first 3 weeks of the visit, and all 30 had contained the word "please," and none had contained a question. There had been a morning in the drawing room, early in the visit, when Lady Edith had received Mrs. Forsyte for tea, and Cecily had been seated at the writing table in the far corner, managing the household correspondence as she always managed it, neither summoned to the conversation nor dismissed from the room. She had been doing this for 18 months, and she had long ceased to find it strange. The women spoke together about the season, about Helena's prospects, about the considerable advantages the Ashbourne alliance would represent. At some point, Lady Edith had said, in the comfortable aside of a woman addressing a friend of long standing, "My companion, Miss Vane, is in the corner. One forgets she is there, which is precisely why she is useful." Mrs. Forsyte had glanced in the direction of the writing table and immediately glanced away, in the manner of a woman who has been told where to look and seen exactly what she expected to see there. Nothing requiring attention. Cecily had continued writing. She had formed each letter with the same even hand. She had not looked up. Mr. Forsyte was a man of business turned gentleman landowner, loud with good humor and louder still with his opinions on the proper management of great estates. And he arrived at dinner on the 3rd evening of the visit in a mood of expansive self-congratulation, and proceeded to speak at length about the natural order of things. Cecily was seated at the far end of the table, between the Earl's steward, a quiet man named Halliwell, and an elderly cousin of Lady Edith's, who was slightly deaf and disinclined to conversation. She had attended these dinners for 18 months, and eaten her soup and her meat, and looked at her plate at the appropriate intervals, and no one had looked at her. Mr. Forsyte was speaking about ladies' companions, among other things. "That sort of woman," he said with the comfortable authority of a man who has never been that sort of anything. "The clergyman's daughter in reduced circumstances. One forgets she is there until one has need of her, and then one forgets again as soon as the need is met. They drift in and out of households like weather. No one really accounts for them." He was not speaking to her. He was not speaking about her specifically. He was speaking to Lord Ashbourne at the head of the table, in the way of a man establishing shared premises before moving to his actual argument. Lady Edith had given the smallest smile at her fan. Helena had been engaged with her fish. Cecily had put her soup spoon down very carefully and looked at the candle in front of her, and thought about the boots in Agnes's room, which she had noticed 3 days ago when she helped Agnes carry a bundle of linens up the back stairs. She had thought about them with the specific quality of attention she usually reserved for things she was not yet ready to decide about. The Earl had said nothing. She had not looked at him. She had no reason to look at him. If she had looked, she might have noticed that he had set his own fork down at almost the same moment she set down her spoon, and that his eyes had moved down the table to where she sat, and that they had rested on her face for a long and unreadable moment before he turned back to Mr. Forsyte and said, quite quietly, "I believe Miss Vane studied music as well as French, Forsyte. She was in company with Halliwell this morning, reviewing the accounts for the East tenancy. Her arithmetic is considerably better than mine." The table had laughed at this, because it was Lord Ashbourne who had said it, which made it a witticism. No one had looked at Cecily. She had looked at her spoon. She had not understood what he meant. She did not yet have the language for what he had done. That was the evening she had begun, privately and without ceremony, to be interested in him. The witnessing had happened on a Wednesday afternoon in May, which she had not known was a witnessing at the time, and would not understand as one until considerably later, in the way of things that matter most, disclosing their significance only in retrospect. Edmund had a cold. He was 4 years old and had a cold, and his nurse had put him to bed in the nursery with a warm brick wrapped in flannel. And at 2 in the afternoon he was not asleep, but was sitting in the middle of his small bed with his blanket around his shoulders, making the low and particular sound of a child who is miserable, but has not yet decided whether to cry about it. Cecily had passed the nursery on her way to the upper gallery on an errand for Lady Edith, tasked with finding a specific volume of sermons that she suspected Lady Edith had not opened in a decade, but wished to have available for the Forsytes. And she had heard the sound, and she had stopped. She had not been asked to attend to Edmund. That was not her role. That had never been her role. She went in anyway. She sat on the edge of the bed and said, "You needn't make that sound if you are not going to cry." And Edmund had looked at her with the serious red eyes of a child who had been told the same thing twice by adults who did not sound as if they meant it, and had decided this one might. "Would you like me to read to you?" she said. "I have a book." She did not at that precise moment, but she went to the small shelf where the nurse kept the household's children's volumes and found a battered copy of a collection of fables and brought it back and read to him for 40 minutes, while he ate a piece of bread with the blanket still around his shoulders and gradually stopped making the sound. She did not know that the Earl had walked past the open nursery door midway through the second fable. She did not know that he had stopped in the corridor, where the light from the nursery window fell in a long, pale rectangle on the floor, and that he had stood outside the door for perhaps 3 minutes before moving away without making a sound. Edmund had asked near the end of the 40 minutes, "Will you come back tomorrow?" Cecily had said she did not know, because she did not, which was not what a child wanted to hear. And she watched his face rearrange itself around the answer, and felt the specific weight of being the honest person in a room full of kind uncertainties. She had not come back the next day, because Lady Edith had needed her. And the day after that. And the day after that. Edmund had begun to appear in doorways she was passing through, with the quiet purposefulness of a small person who has identified a resource and is determined to secure it. She had not known what to do with being noticed by a 4-year-old. She had forgotten what it felt like, She found, to her surprise, that she did not mind it at all. The gallery at Ashbourne ran along the entire east wing and was hung with portraits that Cecily had studied carefully in the first weeks of her arrival, partly from genuine curiosity, and partly because looking at portraits was an occupation that required nothing of the people who occupied rooms nearby. The late Earl looked out from oil and canvas with the patient authority of a man who had never doubted his position. There were children in several of them, arranged around their mother with the stiff propriety of figures who had been told to hold still and had done so with varying success. There was one portrait that had no placard beneath it, which Cecily had noted, and moved past every time without allowing herself to look at it too long. She was looking at it now because it was directly in her path to the shelf where the sermons were shelved, and because Lady Edith had wanted the third volume, and the third volume was on the far end of the shelf directly below the painting, and Cecily was obliged to stop in front of it. The woman in the portrait was young, perhaps 20. She had light brown hair dressed simply and eyes that held a quality of specific happiness, not the general contentment of commissioned portraits, but the happiness of a person who has been persuaded by the painter to think about something particular. She wore a gown in a soft rose color. She held nothing. She was not posed in the formal sense. She looked as though she had turned to face the painter in the middle of saying something. Her name was Anne. Cecily had not heard him enter. She turned too quickly and knocked her elbow against the shelf behind her, and the books did not fall, but they shifted, and he reached past her to settle them with one hand and then stepped back to the proper distance, and they were both looking at the portrait. He did not look at Cecily. He looked at the painting with the particular quality of a man who has learned to look at something painful in the way one looks at a fire. Directly, because looking away takes more effort. "She died 4 years ago," he said. "Edmund was 3 days old." His voice was level. It was the voice he used at table and in the study, and in the lower corridor at 4:30 in the morning. She had heard it perform many functions. She had not heard it perform this one before. "I was in London," he said. "The estate business was legitimate. I had made a calculation." He paused. The calculation was wrong. He moved his hand to the breast pocket of his coat. Not a deliberate gesture, but the kind of reflex that a body makes when it is used to checking that something is still there. Cecily saw the edge of a small oval frame through the fabric and understood. "I am sorry, my lord," she said. It was not adequate. She knew it was not adequate. The forms of address existed, in part, for the moments when nothing adequate could be said, and she had lived long enough in constrained circumstances to know that sometimes the inadequate thing said with sincerity was better than the silence that preceded it. He looked at her then. Not the glance he gave her at table. Not the brief acknowledgement of a corridor. He looked at her in the way of a man who has said something he did not plan to say, and is now taking stock of who he has said it to. "You were reading to Edmund," he said. She said, "He had a cold." "He told me," the Earl said. "He told me twice." There was something in his voice that was not quite warmth and not quite distance. She did not have a word for it. She had a precise awareness of the 2 feet of air between them and the afternoon light slanting through the gallery windows, and the way his hand had settled back to his side without completely settling. She found the 3rd volume of sermons. She left the gallery. She was halfway down the corridor when she realized she was not thinking about Lady Edith at all. If you have stayed with this story, if you have felt what it is to be in a room and not be seen, then you know what it cost her to want nothing, and you know what it meant when she began, quietly and without permission, to want something. Stay a little longer. She had known about Lady Edith's plan before Agnes told her. She had known in the way one knows things that one has not been told. The arrangement of chairs at dinner, the number of times Lady Edith consulted her correspondence with Mr. Forsyte before visitors arrived, the particular quality of satisfaction in Lady Edith's voice when she spoke of Helena's season prospects. Cecily had simply not allowed herself to name it, because naming it would have required deciding what to do about it, and she had not been ready. She was ready on a Tuesday morning in June, the week before the engagement ball. Agnes had come upstairs with a tray of morning chocolate and closed the door behind her in the way she did when she had something to say that required the door to be closed. Agnes was not given to drama. When she arranged her face with deliberate expressionlessness, she meant it as a courtesy. "Lady Edith spoke to Mrs. Bracewell this morning," Agnes said, "after you had gone to sit with her for the morning letters." Cecily said, "What did she say?" Agnes said, "That after the engagement is announced, there will be no requirement for a companion in the household. That Miss Forsyte, when she comes to Ashbourne as the Countess, has her own attendants, and the position will be surplus." She set the tray down. She said it the way she says things she has already decided. She paused. She said, in the way of women who have decided something and find it slightly tiresome to need to say it aloud. One forgets she is there, which is why it will not be a difficult adjustment. Cecily was quiet for a moment. "She was not speaking of you as though it would hurt you," Agnes said. "That is the part I found the worst of it." Cecily said, "No, she would not." She had been dismissed from positions before. Once, in fact, from a situation in Bristol she had held for 4 months before the family decided to economize. That had not felt like this. That had felt like the ending of a temporary arrangement. This felt like a verdict. This felt like having 18 months of evidence collected and organized into a single, precise conclusion. She had left no impression. She had practiced invisibility so thoroughly that she had achieved it. She had not been seen. She had not even been seen enough to be dismissed with feeling. She spent the morning in a state of unusual clarity. At noon, she went to Agnes's room and asked, quietly, whether she might borrow the boots. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," Agnes said. "But you should know Miss Forsyte's maid told Mrs. Bracewell this morning that Miss Forsyte considers you perfectly pleasant and could not describe you if asked. Those were the exact words." She paused. "You deserve to know what was said. You also deserve to know that I could describe you in considerable detail, and that no one has asked me." Cecily had taken the boots and gone back to her room, and sat for a time with them in her lap. They smelled of blacking and cold stone, and the particular damp of the servants' courtyard. They were ordinary boots. They were the boots of someone who could walk out the back of a great house and be assumed to belong to no part of it that would notice the leaving. She packed her bundle. She did not sleep. She waited for 4 o'clock. She did not open the gate. This is what she told herself. In the passage between the still room and the servants' gate, while the frost crept under the gap at the bottom of the door, and the orchestra above her started the second set. She was simply gathering herself. She was deciding. She was exercising the very last of the discretion available to a woman in her position, which was the discretion of when to leave. The truth, which her body knew before her mind caught up to it, was simpler. She did not open the gate because she had passed the Earl in the lower corridor an hour ago, and he had stepped aside and said nothing. And that had been worse than anything Lady Edith had said, or Mr. Forsyte had said, or Helena's maid had said, because she had not known until that moment that she had been waiting for him to say something. She had not known that his opinion had come to matter to her in the specific way that one person's opinion matters when all the other opinions in the world have spent 18 months confirming that you are not worth the trouble of forming one. He had let her go. He had said nothing. She had rounded the corner, and he had stood in the dark with a guttering candle, and she had walked toward the gate, and she had stopped. She was still stopped. The garden door opened from the house side. She heard his boots on the kitchen flagstones before she saw him, because he did not have Agnes's boots, and he had not stuffed the toes with paper, and he had not spent 18 months practicing how not to be heard. He came through the kitchen passage and the still-room door and into the lower corridor with a candle in one hand and nothing in the other, and no particular expression on his face, except the expression she had come to recognize over 18 months as the one he wore when he had decided something and had not yet decided how to say it. Agnes was behind him, which was strange, until Cecily realized Agnes had apparently been waiting in the kitchen and had followed. Mrs. Bracewell, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway to the kitchen passage in her dressing gown with a candle of her own, and the expression of a woman who has decided that this is above her to manage and below her to miss. He stopped when he saw her, she said before he could speak, because she was no longer willing to wait to be spoken to. Your mother plans to dismiss me after the engagement. There is no slight in it. It is a practical matter. I merely wish to spare her the formality. He said. I know, she said. You knew. I spoke to Hallowell this morning. He paused. He did not look away from her face. I spoke to Mr. Forsythe this evening, before the ball. Another pause. The arrangement with Miss Forsythe has been renegotiated. The engagement will not be announced tonight. She looked at him. The frost was coming more strongly now under the gap in the gate. The candles both of them held threw unsteady light. Agnes had gone very still in the passage behind him. That does not change my situation, my lord. No, he said. Your situation is what I came to speak about. He crossed the corridor. He did not hurry. He moved with the same deliberate quality he moved with in every room she had ever seen him in, as though the space between where he was and where he intended to be was already settled and merely needed to be traversed. He stopped when there was a proper arm's length between them, and he looked at her face, and she looked at his. You have been here for 18 months, he said. In that time, you have read to my son when he was unwell. You refused a bribe my mother offered you in November. She told me, in one of her more candid moments, that she had asked you not to encourage Edmund's attachment and had offered you 10 shillings to redirect him to the nursery, and you had returned the coins to her and said nothing. You corrected the East tenancy accounts in a way Hallowell tells me saved the household £43. You have sat at my dinner table and been spoken over and spoken past, and you have never once said a word about it, which I do not think was weakness, but which I have found, increasingly, unendurable to watch. She said carefully, I have managed well enough, my lord. You have managed, he said, as a woman who has decided to become invisible, which is not the same thing at all. She said nothing. Her hands were cold. The boots were too large. The frost had come under the gate. He looked down at her feet. He looked at the boots. Agnes's brown leather boots, stuffed with paper, laced tight at the ankle. And then he looked up at her face, and something moved through his expression that was not quite a smile, and not quite grief, and was entirely, specifically, human. Whose boots are those? He said. She said, Agnes's. Agnes, in the passage, made a small sound. Why Agnes's boots? He said. They are the boots, Cecily said, of a person no one watches leave. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Bracewell, in the kitchen doorway, made no sound at all. Miss Vane, he said, and then he stopped himself and said, Cecily. And her name in his voice was a different thing entirely from her name in anyone else's voice, because he said it with the specific gravity of a man who has decided to use it deliberately, and she felt the change of it somewhere in her chest. I find I cannot let Ashbourne forget you are here. Agnes exhaled. Mrs. Bracewell looked at the ceiling. Well, he held out his hand. She looked at it. She looked at his face. She looked down at Agnes's boots, which were still on her feet, which were still on the cold stone of the lower corridor, which was still the back of a great house at 11:30 at night, with the orchestra faintly audible above them, and the frost coming in from the garden. She had spent 18 months becoming invisible. She had done it so thoroughly that she had nearly made herself believe it. She had borrowed a kitchen-maid's boots and packed a 4-year-old's worth of savings and gotten 6 paces from the servants' gate and stopped. She had stopped because some part of her had refused to finish the act. Some part of her had looked at the gate and known that opening it was the completion of a verdict she had not rendered herself. She was not the verdict Lady Edith had composed. She was not the vacancy Mr. Forsyte had described at dinner. She was not the unmemorable figure Helena Forsyte's maid had been unable to describe. She was the woman who had corrected the accounts and refused the bribe and read the fables and looked at Anne's portrait and said the inadequate thing with sincerity and not gone through the gate. She took his hand. It was warm from the candle. His fingers closed around hers with the careful pressure of a man who was not accustomed to holding things lightly. That was all, in that moment. The orchestra above them, the frost on the stones, Agnes retreating discreetly into the kitchen passage, Mrs. Bracewell withdrawing with the dignity of a woman who has seen everything and will say nothing until it is appropriate. The candles. He did not let go of her hand. She did not ask him to. The morning came in gray and cold, and she woke in the guest room that Mrs. Bracewell had prepared without being asked, in a bed with more blankets than she had slept under in 18 months, and looked at the ceiling for a long time before she turned her head and saw Agnes's boots standing by the door where she had left them. They looked very ordinary in the morning light. Brown leather, worn at the toe, the paper she had stuffed inside them still there, the laces still tight. They were the boots of a person who was leaving. She had never taken them off last night. Not until Mrs. Bracewell had pressed a cup of warm milk on her, and she had sat in the chair by the guest room fire and taken them off herself, and set them by the door, and gone to bed in her stockings. She was looking at them when Edmund knocked. He did not wait to be invited. That was a habit he had acquired from the study of Cecily Vane, who entered rooms when they needed entering, and he had apparently decided to adopt the practice. He was 4 years old, in his nightshirt, with his hair doing something complicated at the back, and he looked at her with the evaluating expression that she had come to associate with his most serious inquiries. "Are you going?" he said. She said, "I do not know yet." He came into the room. He looked at the boots by the door. He went to them and picked one up and turned it over in the serious way of a child examining a thing for its properties, then set it back down. He sat in the chair by the fire that was still warm from last night. "They are too big," he said. "Yes," she said. "They are Agnes's," he said. "Yes." He considered this. "Agnes is staying," he said. She told me this morning." He looked at Cecily. "Are you staying?" She opened her mouth and did not say anything for a moment. The door, which Edmund had left open behind him, admitted a sound of footsteps in the corridor that she recognized by now the way you recognize something you have been listening for, without knowing you were listening. He stopped in the doorway. He was properly dressed this morning, coat and cravat and all the rest of it, but he had not yet achieved the particular composure of a man who has had his coffee, and she found that she preferred him this way. There was a line between his brows that was not displeasure. He was looking at Edmund first, and then at her, and then at the boots by the door. His hand went to his breast pocket, the same reflex she had seen in the gallery. This time he did not leave his hand there. He took the miniature out. He held it in his palm, not hiding it, simply holding it. The small oval shape of it. The painted face of the woman who had been 20 and happy, and had turned to say something to the painter. Cecily understood what the gesture was. Not an ending. Not an explanation. The acknowledgement that it existed, that it was carried, that it would continue to be carried, that a hand already carrying something can still extend itself to someone else, if the decision to extend it is made. Edmund looked from the miniature to Cecily with the comprehensive attention of a child monitoring a negotiation between adults. Robert Weston, the Earl of Ashbourne, held out his hand. She looked at him. She looked at Edmund. She looked at the boots by the door. Then she put her feet on the cold floor and stood up and crossed the room. She took his hand. She did not reach for the miniature, and she did not pretend it was not there. He did not put it away. It rested in his palm between them, Anne's small painted face looking up at the gray morning light, and they stood in the doorway of the guest room at Ashbourne Park in Derbyshire, in the early 6th month of the year 1815. And the house around them was quiet. Edmund said, from the chair, "You are staying." He said it as a declaration, rather than a question, in the manner of someone recording a fact. He had his father's quality of arriving at conclusions and declining to negotiate them. Cecily said, "It seems so." The boots sat by the door where she had left them. Agnes would take them back this afternoon. She would carry them down the back stairs that Cecily had walked the night before, and she would wear them in the kitchen passage and the still room and the servants' courtyard, because they were working boots, and they had always been working boots, and their purpose had never been escape. They had simply been borrowed for an hour by a woman who had practiced so long at being nothing that she had nearly succeeded. She had not succeeded. A 4-year-old had found her out. A steward had noticed her arithmetic. A man with a miniature in his pocket and a habit of standing in doorways had watched her walk away and then followed. The morning light came into the room slowly. Outside, the frost on the grass was beginning to melt. The house above them would wake soon. The footmen, the maids, Lady Edith with her plans and her arrangements that had now been rearranged. The guest wing being made ready for the Forsytes' departure. There would be conversations. There would be adjustments. There would be the procedural work of a household reorganizing itself around a decision that one of its members had made in a lower corridor at 11:30 in the presence of a kitchen maid and a housekeeper and a pair of borrowed boots. None of that had happened yet. What had happened was this. A woman had worn someone else's boots to walk out of a life that had decided she was too small to matter and had gotten 6 paces from the door and had stopped. And someone had noticed the stopping, had come back for the woman who had stopped. Robert's hand was warm. The miniature was small and cool against his palm. Edmund was watching them with complete attention and no intention of going anywhere. She had spent 18 months making herself easy to lose. She was not going to be lost.